Before I introduce Chris, who's going to do the lecture tonight, a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, my name is Faye Bendrups and I'm the current Acting Director of UNCLUS, the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies here at the ANU. Now, if you're not already on the UNCLUS mailing list, there's a sign-in sheet outside, so make sure you get your name on that list, because UNCLUS, as probably many of you know, runs a substantial series of lectures, films, cultural nights, as well as academic work with seminars and conferences throughout the year. So if you'd like to be informed of that, just make sure you get your name on the mailing list. There's also a group called Friends of UNCLUS, so if you're interested in joining that too, make sure you put your name down. And we're very happy to have Chris Carter here tonight to present for UNCLUS the very first of the 2014 public lecture series. And Chris is going to talk about the Andes and the Inca. And Chris is an archaeological consultant and PhD candidate here at the ANU and has worked as a heritage advisor for major projects such as mining and infrastructure developments. His current research includes a study of the prehistoric economy of coastal northern Chile and the archaic and formative periods of the Atacama region of northern Chile and southern Peru. Chris has been a regular presenter of courses here at the ANU Centre for Continuing Education and also at the University of Sydney Centre for Continuing Education, and focusing on the archaeology of Latin America and Spain. But he's also taken teaching outside of the classroom and takes groups of students to archaeology study tours. And what better way to learn and to study than by experiencing all the things that are discussed in academia and taking it out there in a practical methodology, experiential. And he's taken tours to countries including Chile, Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Spain, Ireland and Turkey. So everybody, please make welcome Chris Carter.
Thank you, Jane. Now, you're my guinea pigs because this is a lecture that actually we delivered to the National Gallery in association with the Gold and the Incas exhibition. So this is a forerunner for that lecture, which will be on the 5th of April. So if you see it tonight, you needn't go to the gallery. But I do urge you, if you haven't seen it, to go and have a look at the exhibition. What I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to talk in quite general terms. I'm not going to be that specific about any particular area, because I think we need to contextualise this wonderful exhibition that is currently on display in the gallery. We need to tie it together because the exhibition is known as the Gold and the Incas. It's not all gold and it's not just the Incas. And hopefully by the end of tonight you'll understand that it is all gold but not necessarily the precious metal. So I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the country, because if you don't understand the country and particularly the environment, you're not going to understand the cultures that are developed within it. And then I want to sort of deconstruct the Inca Empire because they're only there for just a bit of a blip on the horizon. Now, I haven't got a laser pointer, so what I'm going to use is this cursor. Now, can you all see that? Does that do the right? I mean, I'm looking at the screen here, so I'm relying on what we can see up the back. What we're going to talk about eventually is Tiwanaku. Now, that is actually the empire. We use the term empire. It's a more Western term, but that's what how the Spanish described it. And Tiwanaku is actually the empire, the land of the Inca. And the Inca were a very small group of people, very low population. There weren't too many of them, because if you weren't of royal blood, you weren't an Inca. You're Yanacona, you're a member or subservient to the Inca. And when the Spanish arrived, this was roughly the extent of the Inca Empire. It's actually being pushed further south. An Inca trail actually passed straight through the Plaza de Armas in Santiago in Chile. It's being pushed a little bit further eastwards into the jungle areas. Very, very difficult area to work, and also very difficult to find anything because it doesn't preserve. And it's actually pushed through into Colombia these days. That's not necessarily saying there's a massive Inca presence. You're not going to find these massive monumental structures. You're going to have evidence of their presence and their power, and probably through trade. But here we are, we'll go back and we'll actually look at the chronology. Now this doesn't go back very far. We're looking at 2,500 BC, so 4,500 years ago, and we're talking in this period here right through is what we would call the developmental period, the archaic period. What we would call that in European terms would be the Paleolithic leading into the Neolithic. And in the New World, we give that the term that the archaic moving into the formative, and then we start to see these cultural groups form here. We tend not to label the groups back this far with those sort of cultural names like Moche or Paracas or something like that. But you have a look at all these cultural groups here. You might recognise some of these names. You might have seen Moche, you might have seen Chimu, Lambaeke, perhaps not. Kapisnike, perhaps not. And then you get right down to the bottom and you see Inca. So the Inca on this chart were around from about 1400 to 1532 when the Spanish arrived. It's an arguable figure because if you go to this chart, different textbooks, similar sort of chart, you've got the Inca from 1200 to 1532. I mean, that's a big difference. That's actually doubled their life on Earth. But what the difference being is this is the Inca as they were living in and around Cusco, and when you look at the 1400 figure, it's when they expanded and become an empire, not just a small state. But you can see there's a whole range of geographic and temporal variation that all builds up to become what the Inca, and we'll get to them eventually. So what we're going to do now is just give you a very quick overview of the nature of the environment. And I've called this the Andes and the Inca because what ties the entire empire together is this massive mountain chain. It is the largest mountain chain in the world. It's even larger when you consider that it's just an extension of the Rocky Mountains. So it goes from virtually the Antarctic regions right through to the Arctic regions, with the Panama Isthmus linking the two. So it's a lot longer, much more massive than the Himalayas or anything like any other mountain range you're likely to come across. Not quite as high. It has at least one peak in excess of 7,000 metres and then many peaks in excess of 6. This is actually in the southern area. It's the snow line in this area is about 4,000 metres, which is very, very high. When you go down to the far south, the snow line there is about 1,500 metres. But these mountains here is the tail end of the main Cordillera, and average only about 1,700 metres. Whereas you get up into the central Andean region and they have many, many, well over 6,000 metres. From the east, you have the Amazonian basin, a massive, well, it used to be a massive area of rainforest. It still is. When you fly over it, you think, well, what's all the fuss about the clearing? You can see jungle as far as the eye can see, but then all of a sudden you see cleared land as far as you can see. So that is expanding dramatically. That's the rainforest here, and this is the next level of forest, and this is actually cloud forest. Different environment altogether. It's very rugged, it's very wet, but it's wet. This one here it rains, this here it's just generally cloud and foggy and very moist in that regard. So forth. And then you get up into the central Andean region where you have some dramatically high peaks, well in excess of 6,000 metres, permanent snow, glaciated areas, and these massive valleys, huge valleys. And these are all the results of glaciation from the Pleistocene period. So in excess of 10,000 years ago, this area would have been subjected to glaciation, and then at the end of the Ice Age, it's melted. So these are a textbook glacial valleys, the parabolic shape, but volcanic soils, very fertile. You can see here, this is the sort of impact that we have with culture on landscapes, and we'll get to those later. But these massive valleys, absolutely huge. This is the Colca Canyon in southern Peru. It is deeper than the Grand Canyon. It's well over several kilometres deep, depending how you measure it. But these are massive landscapes. Now, I've taken many people over there that geographers, geologists who have a good appreciation of landscapes, but the first time they actually see these landscapes, the impact is quite dramatic because they say this is big country. Everything about it is big. And when you take geologists into the area, they are in awe of it because it's still forming. It's still very, very dynamic landscapes, not like the Australian landscapes. And this is the sort of thing we're talking about. This is one of the largest salt pans, I think the second largest in the world, like Uyuni in Bolivia. It's 400 kilometres long, and it's an uplifted seabed, and it's at 4,000 metres above sea level. This is an island in the lake. It has water in it perhaps 1 month a year. The rest of the time it's dry salt, and it has been mined for salt for many, many thousands of years. And this is a typical landscape up there with the cactus. You don't see much of it because there were no trees up there, so the Spanish cut down all the cactus for firewood. But this island protected this growth because these are very, very old cactuses. This is the Salar de Atacama, another large salt pan. A massive impact on just the nature of the climate in these areas, but you can just think about how that would impact on culture. This is another, it's a bit hard to see here, but this is at an angle of about 80 degrees. It's almost perpendicular, but if you look closely, it's a fossilised seabed, and this is at 4,300 metres above sea level. So you're getting some idea of the nature of the dynamics of this landscape. And then, of course, you've got volcanoes. This is Paranacota at about 5,400 metres. It's dormant. It's through myth. They suggested that they worked out that it was about 1,000 years ago it erupted. The geologists tell us it was anywhere between 800 and 1,200 years ago it erupted. And you can see here still the sides are barren. But you can imagine living in a landscape like this where massive volcanoes are erupting, how that would impact on your view of the world. Then we move into this desertous landscape. And this is one of my favourite parts in the world. This is the Precordillera. So you're coming down out of the main range. This is the foothills. These are the foothills of the Andes, where they range from 4.5 to about 5,000 metres. But some of the canyons here are over 1 kilometre deep. So there's a massive range in the availability of oxygen. It's probably one way to look at it. As you come out of the foothills, you hit the Pampa. And so this is still just the edge of the foothills, and then you get into the Pampa, which undulates for about 120 kilometres, anywhere between 3,000 metres dropping off to about 1,200 metres, with some areas there, wonderful geological formations. Now, this is the driest area in the world. I think arguably equal to Namibia. They don't have droughts. Droughts are not in their vocabulary because when you don't get rain, it's very hard to have a drought. The average annual rainfall in some of these areas, well, they don't have weather stations to record them, but they're around nil. But 0.1 is probably a good average. But you get these major desert areas and there's water. Where you've got water, believe it or not, this soil, sand, is very fertile. If you get water to these areas, it's very good agricultural land. So we've got subterranean water, which comes from the mountains. The snow melts. A lot of water is actually these days is pumped out from the aquifers. It's fossil water, up to 15,000 years old, and not being replaced. But it's this is the fruit and veg production area of northern Chile, each of these quebradas. Absolutely amazing what they produce. And this is one of the strange phenomena that I couldn't get used to. Everywhere around the coast of Australia you see vegetation, whereas here the desert goes all the way to the coast. And the reason it is desert is because of the water. And what you have is this major current that circumnavigates the Antarctic, so the South Polar Current. As it sweeps past Cape Horn, a large proportion of this current is actually caught by the continent and swept northwards. So you've got an Antarctic current that gets forced straight up the coast of South America, and it's very cold. Up here, equivalent latitude, it's about 17 degrees south, so North Queensland, the water temperature average is about 15, so it's very cold. But not only is it cold, it's very, very nutrient rich, so it's a very rich sea lane. But what happens is there's no evaporation, no water evaporation. So you have these very hot, moist air coming across from the east, and so the rain shadow is actually on the coastal side. And the clouds don't form here because of the temperature of the water and the temperature of the air. It's just this really unusual temperature inversion. So it's a very complex weather system, so that results in the Atacama Desert here being permanently dry, and then up here you have a desert that's impacted every 7 to 10 years by El Niño, La Niña cycles. And that happens because you get the Pacific current comes here, gets inside the Humboldt current and pushes this offshore. Now that tends not to get down to these latitudes. So this remains dry over 10, 20, 30-year cycles. Arica, which is just here where I work, it's had a weather station went for 57 years without recording any rain whatsoever, from 1903, I think it was, through to 60. So it's amazing. Come down here, the opposite happens. You end up with 3-4 metres of rain a year, heavy rains. So major differences. So that would have impact on who would move into what area. Why would you move into this desert? Why would you move there where there's 3 metres of rain? So I think, we've got to understand the environment to understand the cultures that move into it. Now, I'll very, very quickly go through this range of theories about the first settlers, who they were, where they came from, and when. Now, we're pretty confident we know who that is, who they were, Asiatic populations. We know where they came from, Central Asia, moving through into Siberia. When they arrived, a big argument that I'll get into in a minute. And then these other arguments that they're still going on about whether there was one group, a continual trickle over many thousands of years, or 3 or 4 waves. And then we've got to look and consider the evidence that come through. Now, this is probably a standard map of the human evolution out of Africa some years ago. And what we're looking at in the New World is this so-called ice-free corridor. So during at the end of the Pleistocene, the end of the Ice Age, we didn't have a solid ice sheet across this area, the Laurentide ice sheet. There was actually an area that formed about 15,000 years ago that was devoid of ice, and people moved through it. More recently, these dates are very rubbery. We're not sure. I mean, this one goes back as far as 25,000 years ago. People crossed the ice-free corridor. But this is the theory that I subscribe to, is that they actually crossed the Beringian Plain and then come down the coast. And they did that about 16,000 years ago. I'm not going to risk my life on that, but I would say at least 16, possibly a bit further, but perhaps not as far as 22, 25. Very, very recently, there's been some papers published that talk about the climate on the Beringian Plain, and it wasn't as harsh as we thought at the end of the Pleistocene, the end of the Ice Age. There was steppe and there was heathland. Not fantastic, but able to support a population. So that's an area worth looking at, and that's where we get the evidence for this coastal migration route. The big problem we have here is that at the end of the Pleistocene, between 10,000 years ago and 7,000 years ago, the sea level rose anything up to 120 metres. Once the ice started to melt, the sea level came up. So that means the coastline we have everywhere, including Australia, is far different than what we've got today until then. But what we have here, particularly, is a very, very deep virtually no continental shelf. So it's very deep, very close in. So the coastline is rather static. So what we have more recently, when I say in the last decade to 15 years, is a number of sites that are starting to come in from Ecuador, northern Peru, and then in central Peru and southern Chile that really are adding a lot of weight to the argument of coastal migration theories. And this is the area I'm working in. These are dates that get well into the Pleistocene, and then you move to this is the sort of thing we're looking at, what I was getting at. Sorry, my slides are out of order. We'll get to it in a minute. There's a site that comes up here now that's 14,000 years old. Prior to that, we were looking at 13,500 years at Monteverde. This is the sort of material we find in those very early populations. Very, very simple. It's very scant. We look at the implements used for hunting and or butchering. And then we look at the evidence of what they were butchering. Native animals that extant today, Darwin's raya, we've got the sea lions, large animals, anything up to 400 kilograms. We're certainly finding remains of those. There's still population there today. And if you have keen eyes, you'll see a little fellow here. You see him sitting on a rock? That's the guinea pig. Now that's the wild guinea pig. It's only tiny. It'd be a good rat from Canberra would outpace him and would provide more food. They've domesticated the guinea pig, and so they're a lot larger. And not that there's a lot of meat on a guinea pig anyway, but they're a larger animal. And these are a range of the tubers that were consumed today, but into the prehistoric past. And I mean, you would all be aware of the potato coming from that region. These are wild animals that go back into the Pleistocene. They're Wanako, which is the primogenitor of a llama. They believe so anyway. This is the wild animal, all the same colour, not a heavy coat. And so this animal was domesticated about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago to the llama. And then you've got vicuña, which is a more gracile, smaller species. I think I might have a slide coming up. And they were domesticated into the alpaca. We're not 100% sure. There was probably some crossbreeding, but there are some linkages genetically between the two. But these animals were hunted, and then gradually they were brought in and perhaps domesticated. But when we're looking for the evidence of some of the earlier populations, this is a rather new one. This is Huaca Prieta, and you might find some materials in the exhibition that come from Huaca Prieta, because this is a mound. It's not a hill. Use the term mound, but I mean a lot of people and a lot of textbooks would call it a pyramid, because this was a constructed building that had a lot of sharp sides. It's just weathered away to be smooth-sided. But excavating underneath this has been occupied from just over 14,000 years ago, and then these mounds were constructed in what we call the cotton pre-ceramic about 4,500 years ago. So 10,000 years before that, people were living here on the banks of the river, and there's the sea. So they were exploiting the coast and coming inland here and probably exploiting wild plants that were growing on the banks of the river. You can see here their agriculture there today. As we go down the coast, this is the area where I'm working. This is a steep cliff and a nice beach, but this point here is 700 metres above sea level. These are big, as I said, it's a big country. And the water out here is very, very deep. So this is in the Atacama Desert, but you can see here there's a lot of vegetation, and this is a lagoon that floods every year or two when there's big storms in the mountains. But we've got dates here. We're quite excited that we've actually got a date at 9,000. We've only done test pitting there, not a detailed and complex excavation that's coming up over the next few years. So this is the sort of thing we're looking at. We've got this early occupation on the coast. So this is where people started. The first step towards cultural complexity is actually found in northern Chile. And what we have here is a hunter-gatherer group that we can date from the late Pleistocene. We won't call them Chinchorros back in the late Pleistocene, but they were fishing, hunting sea lions, seabirds, not so much terrestrial fauna, because there wasn't a lot there to hunt, but they were very well adapted to the sea. But for some reason or another, about 7,500 years ago, they started to mummify their dead. And this wasn't just putting them out in the sun to dry. These were complex artificial mummies. And these puts them about 2,500 to 3,000 years older than the mummies from Egypt. So these are the oldest artificial mummies in the world by far. And so this is an example from the museum in Arica in northern Chile. And this is a diagram showing how they're made. They're actually completely dismember a body, deflesh it, remove the organs, and then put it all back together again with ropes and sticks. You can see here there's some timber in there, and then they mould the shape of the body in mud. So it's an unusual complex, but you can see there's some cultural development. We're moving away from simple hunter-gatherers. We're perhaps seeing the idea of perhaps not religion, but at least ancestor worship or worship of the dead. When we look at their economy, we're looking at a good range of implements that are well suited for harvesting resources from the sea. And some of those resources are quite large. The sea lions, but we've also got evidence of shark and so forth, swordfish, and lots of shellfish. I mean, and what I find interesting is that some of these artefacts here are 6,000 and 7,000 years old. This is what the Atacama Desert can do. You can still use the string to go fishing with, cotton string. Is that when the Inca arrived, however many years later, 5,000, 6,000 years later, they were using the same thing. All right. So we'll just go through these mummies. So the oldest artificial, as I said. The oldest mummies, surprisingly, are the most complex. And these are known as black mummies because they're actually coated with a black manganese paste. Interestingly, adults were mummified, males and females. And as well, there's a lot of sub-adults, infants, and including fetuses. Preterm fetuses were mummified. Actually, some of the oldest are preterm fetuses. So perhaps the occurrence of stillborn in the grieving process was the result. The mummification was a result of that. You can see here how they're complex. They're bound up. Yeah, just other examples here of the different range. So there's cultural variation occurring, but very, very early in the piece. Far earlier than what we see cultural variation anywhere else because we don't have this sort of artefacts to actually study. This is an interesting body here because this is a mummy that's been wrapped up in a skin of a pelican. The skin with the feathers still attached. So it's got a feather cape and it's wrapped it all up. About 5,000 years ago, they shifted from black to red. Now, this is not all of them. This is the major percentage. And the difference was instead of manganese paste, they used an iron oxide. But it wasn't just the colour of the mummies. They become simpler. Normally, when we see cultural complexities arise, things become more complex. This is what we see in Egypt. Their mummification processes became more complex as time went on. Here we see they are simplified. I won't go into the techniques, but these are a lot simpler, and perhaps not as many people were mummified in this fashion as the black ones. This is just a couple of examples of children. And then you get the majority of the mummies from 5,000 were simply mud-coated. These weren't the complex artificial mummies, but from the same period. And here we just got some of the other embellishments, red hair. And this is a female, has a spear point sitting on the body, which is interesting for a female. But this here, I don't know if you can make it out, that line there is actually a vertebra. That is a newborn baby laid on the chest of this woman. Maybe she died in childbirth and the baby died with her. But it was very, very interesting find, that one. This was actually a salvage excavation underneath a hotel in Arica as they were building it. This is some of the grave goods you get. Not a lot of grave goods, but this is one of my favourite pieces. This is an infant's hand. The skin's still intact. You can still see the fingerprints, but it's holding a stone knife. So anything that gets buried in the sands in that area, no rain, no moisture, it preserves forever. So we're very, very lucky in that regard. So what we're going to do is move along very, very quickly. As I said, it's going to be very general. But what happened? We had this cultural complex known as the Chinchorro, named after the beach where they were originally found, were active fishermen, sometimes hunters, but along the coast, restricted very much to the coast of northern Chile, southern Peru. About 4,500 years ago, they started to, the complexity of their mummification processes dropped away, and all of a sudden, you stop seeing these supine extended burials, and we start to see mummies that aren't artificially prepared. They're in a fetal position, their knees are up to their chest, and they're generally buried in a tomb or in a complex sitting up. That's a huge difference. So what we're seeing here is cultural infusion generally coming in from the highlands. And this technique or burial practice continued right through until after the Spanish arrived. And what the other evidence we find when we're looking at the Chinchorro people, and I'm speaking specifically about them, but this was more widespread, are the arrival of domesticates. We start to see agriculture, simple agriculture arise, and the arrival of new crops. Now, the area where I'm working in the canyon, there are some reeds. There's the ubiquitous in Australian landscape anyway, peppercorn tree, Mollis Shinus moye, which was an edible fruit. Wild cotton for making fishing gear, but not a lot to eat. And all of a sudden you start to see squash, different forms of pumpkin, beans, solanaceae in the form of tomatoes, or a wild tomato and wild chilies, and then corn. So we just start to see the arrival of the domesticates. And if you have a look at the range of domesticates that come from this area, where would our diet be without that? You know, you go through that list and it's incredible. Our diet would be we'll be struggling to find something to eat in any restaurant in this city without one of those ingredients. You know, I don't know where Asian food, how that got on without chili. And it comes from this area. This is one of the major staples that became domesticated about 4,500 years ago in different areas and different times. And what we find is a very, very simple spike with shattering heads, more like a grass, and then all of a sudden we start to see non-shattering cobs, multiple rows, huge cobs of corn. To the end of the day, we have these massive returns. So genetic engineering really was being done 4,500 years ago. They were breeding and domesticating corn to produce these crops. And of course, potatoes. The home of the potato is arguably Peru. Those from southern Chile, the island of Chiloé, would argue that that's where potatoes were domesticated. It's likely that they were both domesticated around the same time, but from different varieties of the salama. And this is highland crops producing potato. They're freeze-drying them, because when you're at 4,500 metres, it's pretty easy going. And a freeze-dried potato lasts for about 10 years if you keep them dry. Their flavour doesn't. They're actually very nutritious after 10 years when they're rehydrated. Absolutely no flavour whatsoever, or nice flavour anyway. No doubt you've all heard of quinoa. That's a crop that was grown extensively through the highlands. There is some evidence of it expanding down into the coast. We've certainly got a lot of corn there. And here we just see this is a little show garden with corn, fava beans and quinoa all growing. But these are the quinoa crops from the highlands. There's about 4 different species of chenopod. Can't think of the names, local names, but there's 4 other chenopods that are grown up there in different environments and different altitudes. Around the same time, we start to see the domestication of the animals. We see the differences in the skeletal remains, in the fecal remains that we find in middens. And in this case, we've got alpaca, and of course you've got llama, and then the guinea pig. About 3,000 years ago, we start to see guinea pig living with the people. So they're not hunting them, they're actually living in their houses, and they still live in the rural houses today. This is an alpaca. This is the vicuña. This is the animal, the wild animal that's still found today, and that's the domesticate. See, huge difference in the bulk. They provide a lot more meat than the vicuña, and a lot more wool, and a lot less hair in an alpaca than there is in a vicuña. Vicuña are actually grown today under licence, raised under licence, and they're plucked. They don't shear them. They're a very fragile animal, and they pluck them, and it's one of the finest wools known, and it's actually very, very expensive, mainly because it's restricted in how it's produced. But that's a full-grown vicuña, and these are young llama. So what I want to talk about around this particular time is we start to see there's inroads into a change in technology, which is coupled with a change in cultural development. We start to see ceramics, metals, textiles, and this is all surrounded by a change in the way people look at their landscape, their economy changes, etc., etc. And so this is where we're heading now. Agriculture brought people together. I can give you an entire lecture just on the rise of agriculture, but if you think about a hunter-gatherer working a landscape, in times of plenty he might share his land with a neighbouring group or several other people. When certain trees the fruits are mature, they might share the abundance. But if you change that and you prepare a plot of land, and this is what we have here, these little areas down here, these are actually prehistoric fields. You prepare a plot of land, you plant your crop, the crop grows, you manage it, keep the animals and the birds away, and then you harvest it, you end up with a surplus. Are you going to share that with too many people? I don't think so. And I think what happens is you have a totally different view of land. We get the idea of land ownership. And so we see cultural complexity really rise up from this particular time. And this next slide is a great example, is that it's an oasis. Okay, so you've got a river flowing down here. There's hardly any water in it, but because the water's taken off in agricultural canals, and actually so the water is running around the edge of the fields and providing water to the fields. So that land has become very valuable. So one thing, you don't want to live there, because if you live on your land, it's going to cut down how much you can grow. So you move up, you move your house just up on a slope where you can't grow crops. Okay, so this is not a large area. It's producing huge surplus. You've got people living over here somewhere in the desert who are struggling away, getting wild fruits and wild animals. They're going to look over here and go, well, we want some of that. So you end up having to form defences. So what we have here is, it's called a pukara. It's a fortress. So it's a defended village. It has silos. So people weren't just moving their residence back up into the hills, so they weren't living on their cultivated lands, but they were actually storing their grain. And then they had to build a wall around it because people would come in and want to take it. And take it they did, because what we see is gradually other groups who assumed that power or maintained the power actually took over large areas. We see changes, massive changes in landscapes. Now this is a modern landscape, and this is a town known as Putre, up near the Peruvian border, just inside of Bolivia. And these terracing here, it's all agriculture, as you can see today, but this terracing goes back to not Inca, it goes about 1,000 years before Inca. And then you start to see irrigation canals. These are not roads, these are canals that bring water from springs right up here, 5, 10, 15 kilometres away. So that's going to change the whole political outlook in this cultural group, is because you have to manage large numbers of people, large cooperative efforts to produce these surpluses. So people are working together, you end up with urban environments, or at least semi-urban. So you move from the hunter-gatherer to someone living in a camp, to someone living in a village, and so you end up with larger towns. And then you really have to start altering landscapes to manage and grow more and more crops, because you've got more and more people. And so this is what we see as the early to middle horizon, and these horizons are cultural horizons. It's an archaeological term we use. We tend to use it in the New World, in South America, these horizons, when you start to see these moves. So what we start to see with the arrival of agriculture and animals, of all these others, but what it leads to is economic complexity, which of course, for that to survive and to grow, it becomes more politically complex. We start to see a move away from functional. So we start to get the aesthetic, a change in power, the power of the individual, an individual freed up from hunting animals all day, to someone who's got the aesthetic abilities, or the aesthetic eye and the creative abilities to actually make objects that are not just functional. This is what you'll see in the exhibition, is this, a range of ceramics, absolutely magnificent textiles, as well as some of these other ritual items. These might look like simple spoons, but they all have a ritual function. And of course the textiles, I showed you that before. So we're looking at vegetable fibres, so cotton. You're not just collecting wild cotton, you're actually growing crops of cotton, which are still grown today. These are native. Fur and feathers, usually for decorative purposes, but what you are doing is breeding up flocks of llama and alpaca, and then capturing vicuña, because you can hardly manage those animals. And these people develop systems to twine and weave, and you'll see very, very good examples of this from around the country in the exhibition. And people living in the Andes today still practice these techniques, more often than not for the sake of their tourists, but they use traditional, not traditional pot, but a traditional dyes and traditional techniques for spinning and dyeing using both organic and inorganic materials. And you can see them using a blowpipe here to actually blow the coals. And that's something we've seen on woodcuts and paintings that they did in the prehistoric and the pre-Columbian period. And then you move on to the weaving techniques and you see these backstrap looms. And we know that they've been in use for a long, long time, about 2,000 years ago at least. These, you can make any length of textile. You just keep winding it on and moving back. And then for the width, you just stitch them together. So you end up with two pieces here joined up the middle. But these people are so skilled and nothing's written down. It's all kept in their heads. They'll work together and work in parallel, and they'll weave together two separate pieces that are virtually identical. And we see images of this as recorded by the Spanish in the very early days of the conquest. And you see here them spinning wool using a simple spindle whirl, and then the backstrap loom here. And we see some wonderful examples, and you'll see this sort of material. This is Chimu and Paracas. You'll see examples of that in the exhibition. But we're looking at, again, the desert providing us with this perfect preservation. And these are some items I found in 2010, and these have been buried for 1,000 years. But, you know, apart from this one having some rat holes in it because it had corn in it, you know, the actual textiles were still quite strong. This is just a woven reed basket. When we look at the ceramics, we start to see ceramics appear about 4,500 years ago. Very, very simple material used for vernacular, domestic cooking pots. No real style, no real design, but then you start to see this incised ware or moulded pieces of varying quality. They used a range of techniques, and whilst they didn't have a wheel, they certainly knew of the functions of a wheel, and they actually used a turntable. But that was mainly for decorative pieces, not actually throwing. And I won't go into details in this, but these are the techniques they generally use for coiling, and they use moulds. Either just a simple sun-dried clay mould and actually line it with clay, worked with the hand, or they coiled it on the outside. But, you know, these different techniques are still used today in rural Bolivia and Peru. And then, of course, you have the impress moulds for mass production, and we'll see some of that example later. When we're looking at mining and metallurgy, exactly the same thing happened in South America as it did in Europe, is they very, very quickly learned how to work gold. This is native gold. It's found in creek beds. Nuggets can be beaten and can be worked very, very simply. But they very quickly learned how to alloy gold and use a made tumbago, which you'll see examples of, because you'll see gold with a greenish tinge, which means working it with and using it with copper, making their gold go that much further. But they also worked bronze. So they had a Bronze Age in South America. And their bronze was alloyed with tin, arsenic and nickel. And they worked it the same as anyone did. This is totally independent development. And we've got smelters and techniques, and this is what we find. This is a site of Catape. It is known as a tambo. It's a storehouse in northern Chile, but it's Inca. And what the Inca were doing here, they were trading the Inca Trail. You can actually see the faint line of the Inca Trail going out here. It disappears over the mountains. They were trading in turquoise. So you have little chips of turquoise, and that's how you follow the Inca trails. You can follow the chips, but this is what they're making with them. These very tiny little beads. But what this is doing is linking back to Cusco. And then, of course, you've got the development of architecture. And we'll look at that separately in a minute. Some amazing masonry techniques. So we'll look at these different groups, and this is what we'll find represented in the exhibition. We start going through here. You'll see Sipán, Capusnique, Huaca Prieta, in the Moche region up here in Chiclao. There's the Moche River. Lima, Lima's not only the capital of Peru, it's also the name of a culture. Pachacamac's a major site on the outskirts of Lima. Paracas and Nazca, two that you might have heard of. One of the oldest urban areas in the New World, it is the oldest, claimed to be the oldest in the New World, is Caral, which is about an hour and a half north of Lima. Relatively recent find, only the last 20 years it's really come to any prominence. But it's a major conurbation with monumental works, and then Huaca Prieta, which I mentioned earlier. Showed you that slide where they dated 14,000. The date's down here, so this is from a different direction. When we move into the mountains, into the highlands, Chavin de Huanta for a long time held the mantle as being one of the oldest monumental sites. That's been usurped by Caral and Huaca Prieta of late. But it's wonderful actual stelae and carvings that are associated with that. And what we start to see is some really distinct pottery forms that were emulated by their successors. And that is the stirrup pot, these anthropomorphic, zoomorphic heads that can be seen both as a feline in some cases, or a human head with a feline features and different fanged deities. Very, very good gold work, as you can actually see these pieces in the exhibition. Moving ahead very quickly, we have Paracas. Now, what Paracas brought us is some of the finest textiles in the New World, but we're looking at 2,500 years ago. There's a major cemetery on the Paracas Peninsula. Paracas is a small village in south-central Peru, a major fishing centre today. But it was a large area where this culture, they had wonderful ceramics. There's thousands of mummies dug up from the necropolis. But these mummies, what makes them special are the textiles. These mummies were buried with any number of clothing. They had underwear, they had mantles, they had robes, they had capes, but not just one. In some of them, there were 70 layers, and they weighed 30 or 40 kilos just in textiles. And when you plot out how many layers of textiles were on an individual, you can work out the hierarchy of different groups, because there'll be one individual with massive amount of clothing, and then another one next to him or surrounding him with only 3 or 4 layers. So these amazing bundles. And it looks as if a lot of these pieces, these mantas, the cloaks, ponchos, I suppose you can call them, were made specifically for this person for their burials. It's a massive input of labour and resources just to bury the dead. And this is the nature, this is the sort of thing we're looking at. A reed cane basket, and they would be placed in there, and then they would be wrapped, and there'd be just dozens and dozens. And in between layers, sometimes you would have gold pieces, and in this case, this is a spondylus shell, a very valuable item. Other shells and feathers, and when we get to the actual body itself, you can hear he's got a nose ring of gold plate and a turban. But just have a look at the nature of the textile. Very closely woven, a mix of cotton and wool, both llama and alpaca wool. But this is a bird, a common bird, a whippoorwill that you find commonly on the desert. But you see this figure repeated in positive and negative, rotated, mirror image, just repeated right across the textiles. And you see here the large bird. Then there's the wing here of another smaller one, and then it getting smaller again. But you've got positive, negative perhaps, and then smaller again. And you can see this figure repeated all over. And this is all done by hand without what we can gather, without a written record. Haven't got a plan. And ethnographically, they've described the people that are weavers, and it's generally the women, and they own a copyright, a certain pattern, and they pass that down to their daughters. So they teach them from a very young age, just through repetition and showing them through observing. And if they don't have daughters, they can actually sell that pattern and teach someone else's daughter that style. They also had very good neighbours. As we see the wane of Paracas, we see the rise of Nazca. They are adjoining, but Nazca tended to be inland. They're an agricultural people, whereas the Paracas were working on the coast. The Nazca were on the Nazca River, on the Nazca Plain. Absolutely superb ceramics. And we use these ceramics as, that are just not pretty pieces on the shelf, because you can actually see this fellow has a sore knee. He has a sore on his knee. I think it's a wonderful piece. He's obviously not a farm labourer. He's very well dressed. He has the turban of a cacique, a chief or a leader. But he's absolutely knocked the skin off his knee, which I think is a beautiful, poignant piece. You can see here he's wearing a turban that's bound, and one of the common features of Nazca is the artificially deformed cranium, so with his elongated skull. You can see here it's just through being head binding from a very, very early age. And getting to that, very, very important, the use of heads. We see a lot of pots that are given anthropomorphic features of a skull. You can see here a bowl with these heads painted on them, and then something attached to them here. And this particular one down here is very accurate, because we actually have the real thing. And I hope I've got the slide there somewhere. They're trophy heads. So these people were very, very busy at war, and their victims were beheaded, and they would come back as victors and carrying, and they'd sometimes have them decorating around their belts, the heads, and then they would be buried with them. So these were their trophy heads. Now this particular pot is a fine example of a trophy head, and what we see in the real thing, meaning the trophy heads you find in tombs, is their lips have been removed to really give them a fearsome look. So you don't want to kill any weaklings, so you only kill those that are really fierce. And they actually pin their eyelids shut with cactus spines. And what they quite often do is have something attached to their hair to carry them, and that's what this appears to be like when they actually form this pot. So it's a beautifully executed piece. Very, very nice. For some reason or other, I've doubled that. I've got that one here again. This is actually a piece of Nazca pottery we just found when we were over in Kawachi a few years ago. But there's a trophy head. And I actually came across this head in the Peabody Museum only last October, November. And I was looking for mummies from this particular area, and when I found this head, I thought it was just the head of a mummy. But what you can see here is this is not the mummy's chin. That's a flap of skin that comes from the back of his neck. So that is a trophy head. And it was buried in with a full mummy, an individual, and so that may well have been one of his victims in battle sometime earlier. Of course, the Nazca people, the Nazca culture, are more widely known for their doodling. And these are massive figures that were formed on landscapes, dated between 3 to 500 AD. Not necessarily dated directly, but dated in relation to the pottery and bits and pieces they find associated with them. But what we look at here are these figures that are hundreds of metres long, these spiders. Straight lines that go for 5, 6, 7 kilometres at times, and there's literally thousands of lines and hundreds of figures on this plain and on the hill slopes. Very hard to see. I mean, that's not my photography. I don't know how they've recoloured or used different contrast or flown very early in the morning. That's what it looks like when you actually fly over it, and you can just make out the head of a large bird with stylised wings there. But what you can see here, in some cases, they're actually vehicular tracks that have been formed. There's vehicular tracks, because the people didn't realise they were there until the 1940s, when Maria Reicha actually plotted them all. And what she thought they were doing, they were calendrical, they were astrological, they were they were means to watch the movement of the stars or the planets or so forth. More recent research suggests they are all for parades. They are ritual pathways, because every line is actually a pathway lined with stones. And it appears that the locals still walk these pathways for different functions. So it's easier to bring in complex theories than it is to actually look at the simple answers that the locals might be able to give you. But, that's not definitely the case, but that's what it appears, that these were ritual pathways and a way So you're looking at cultural complexity coming in a different form. Today, these rituals are performed on Catholic holidays. So they'll carry out a Catholic ritual, but they'll follow the paths of the desert markings. Very quickly moving on to some of the finest ceramics you'll find anywhere in the world. These are known as the Moche pieces from northern Peru. Good examples in the exhibition. Believe that some of these actual heads were made from moulds cast of the individual. They're so accurate, I mean, it looks like you can see the patina on the skin. So these are beautiful pieces, but they tend to be many examples of the one individual. I think they've counted them as only 30 odd or something individuals, so these might have been leaders, royalty, for example, and they made a mould of their face, perhaps a death mask, and then they just mass-produced these figures. We see some wonderful examples of the variety of animals that you'll find. Monkeys are not found in the desert, so they've actually replicating something they saw in the jungle, or perhaps they brought them in as pets. And then, of course, we see examples of their fruit. That's pepino, a little squash. And then we've got some other pottery. So they've got some wonderfully moulded and shaped pottery, but other here is decorated. And they provide us a very, very good insight into some of their activities. Some of their activities are basic. Here's a couple making or imbibing in chicha, which is maize beer. This fellow here is actually using, he's got a bolus of coca. He's chewing coca leaves. He's got a pot with kal, which is a lime, calcium hydroxide, and they use that as a catalyst with a copper dipper. So he's dipping that copper rod into the pot to get a little bit of lime, and he's chewed his coca leaf, absolutely the cocaine in it as doing nothing. You introduce this catalyst and it's instantaneous. He would have his hit from the cocaine in the leaf. And this is, almost 2,000 years ago. So they're into this sort of thing for a very long time. And interestingly enough, the coca grows on the other side of the Andes. So there's certainly contact with, trade from some distance. And no prizes in guessing what's going on here. But the La Cojoil Museum in Lima actually has an X-rated room where you have to be over 18 to enter, and it's very, very explicit. And they are also very, very good goldsmiths, and they were using lapis lazuli, turquoise, a jade sort of material, spondylus shell, and then gold. But what this shows us here is a runner. He's a chusky, and what he's carrying is probably a number of beans. He's carrying messages, carrying coca leaf, and he's shown here as a winged deity. But these are known as chuskies. The Moche were very, very good hydraulic engineers, and this is the Escope Canal that runs for 15 kilometres. This is just for agricultural purposes. Massive, massive outlay required for labour and what have you. And why do they need that much water? I mean, you can't really see it, but it's 4 or 5 metres high, 3 metres wide, and goes for 15 kilometres. And that's bringing water from one valley to another because it didn't have a broad enough floodplain. It had more water, and they needed to move it. This is not the largest pyramid, but this is a pyramid complex in Sipán. So these are mud brick or adobe pyramids, massive pyramids, but as you see, with the La Nina cycle, they get heavy rains, and of course it erodes it away. But in the 80s, they discovered these massive tombs inside these pyramids. This is Walter Alva. He was a regional archaeologist. He was responsible for finding these tombs. That the actual booty was discovered by looters, and the police reported them. They actually shot one dead. And Walter Alva come in and thought, well, this is not that interesting. But when they started digging, they actually found one of the most valuable caches of material ever, archaeologically speaking. And you can see these mummies here. You can see there's gold, there's copper, there's shell. And it's just a priceless collection. You can see here there's life-size peanut shells that are made in gold and silver. We've got shells as an inland site. Yeah. So I very, very quickly go through these, but you can see just the array of gold. And you can see here some of the gold's embellished with copper. And this is what they know as the tumbaga, and the other is pure
And this little figurine is about 100 millimetres, 120 millimetres long, tall. He's carrying a gold mace. He has a bat on his headdress. He's got the nose clip, the same as the mummy we saw before, his little shield. You know, these sorts of things would fetch a lot of money on the black market, and that's why the looters were there. Yeah, So what we saw is this rise up. We saw the development of ceramics, metalworking. What we didn't talk about was masonry, textiles, you know, different artistic styles. There's variations on a theme from the north to the south, from the highlands to the coastal regions. So during the 12th century, this group of people arrived in Cusco, in the valley of Cusco. And this is where we see the coming of the Inca. We are not 100% sure where they come from, mainly because the entire, the evidence for the rise of the Inca is shrouded in myth. And we've got different versions of the same myth. Recorded in the main by the Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century and 17th century recorded what they heard. And we have to be very cautious because a lot of it looks very much like a Christian myth, and the Son of God and so forth. But what we see is a rise around the 12th century. And for 2 centuries, they virtually couldn't break out of the Valley of Cusco, because there were fierce territorial battles with the adjoining groups. So the Inca weren't on their own. There were groups everywhere through that area. Hopefully I've demonstrated that up till now, that there were many, many other groups. And it took an individual in the 14th century to break out of that valley. And then very, very rapidly, within 2 generations, it extended, firstly following the sun to the west, to the coast, and then immediately thereafter extended into northern Peru and conquered the Chimu at Chanchan in 1470, and then continued on into Ecuador. Now this is the downfall during the latter part of the 15th century. So by the time the Spanish arrived, they had extended from Ecuador and they were moving south into Chile. How much of that was influential or how much of that was colonial is still arguable, but they're still finding sites that are identified with the Inca in southern Chile. Certainly some major sites in northwestern Argentina and elsewhere. The Inca myth starts here in Lake Titicaca. The first Inca was born out of the sun down here at the Sacred Rock. You know, whether that's true or not, but they went in search of the Promised Land. I think I've heard that story before, so we have to be very careful on whether we look at the chronology of that and the chronicles. They went from Lake Titicaca here on the island of the Sun, and they travelled north looking for this so-called Promised Land, and they ended up in Cusco, a beautiful, fertile valley. Very similar in latitude and very similar in altitude to Lake Titicaca, but it's a totally different environment. The Lake Titicaca region is hydrologically closed, and so all the water flows into the lake, but what it means is the air doesn't flow either, so it's very cold and very dry. Halfway between Titicaca and Cusco, you go over a rise of about 4,300 metres and you drop down the other side, and all of a sudden there's a major change in the land. And you actually think it's not that much lower. It feels a lot lower. And then you realise that this is actually connected, Cusco is connected by valley to the Amazon basin. Up here, it's a closed system. It's a plateau, and there's no warm air getting to it. So a totally different environment. They found the Promised Land. They very, very quickly moved westwards. Kuntinsuyu is one of the 4 quarters. That's what Tiwanaku means. And then they moved to the north, moved to the west, and then they moved to the south. So the Sapa Inca, the emperor, if you'd like to use that term, based himself in Cusco, and his generals, his caciques, or his governors, would have moved out into these areas, conquering or convincing, probably the best other word, for groups to come under their control. The Inca would move into an area and say, we're now taking over, we're quite happy for you to continue on as you were, you can use your own language, you can worship your own gods, but you're just going to pay tax to us and realise that we're better than you. And more often than not, that was the case. If anyone said, no, we're not having a bar of this. They had the armies available to crush them very quickly. And anywhere where there was dissent, they quite often took away all the able-bodied men and moved them to another area and used them for labour. They were so adept at this system that the Spanish copied it. The Spanish come in and battled, and then all of a sudden they think, hang on, the Inca were doing this one way, let's do the same thing. So the Spanish actually used that very, very successfully. When you look at the Inca material culture, this is a wooden kero, nicely decorated. It's not that good. The textiles are good, but when you think back to the Paracas, 1,000 years earlier, or more than 1,000 years earlier, finer, a lot more intricate. Their metalwork is no different. The skill level, the technological level, they didn't advance it at all. One of their key markers is an arivolo, this shape of a pot. Have a look at the painting on it. It's not that elaborate, it's not that finely executed. Their textiles, their mantos, their clothing, it was no better than those that were there before them. I haven't shown you the examples, but their masonry probably sets them a little apart. Their architecture, they were very, very good stonemasons, but they didn't develop those skills. They were there before them. But their architecture. So I'm not trying to bash the Inca. What they did was superb. But where I think their skills lie is not in architecture. It wasn't in metallurgy. It wasn't in textiles. Their ability to organise and get groups to perform cooperatively to serve the Sapa Inca or the Inca was superlative. They carried out these major projects from the coast to the highlands, from the north to the south. We see that repeated everywhere. You see this major works of architectural finesse, a circular building, something very unusual. You see this, not a repetition, very, very different wherever you go on a similar theme. And when you get to Machu Picchu, which we'll get directly, you'll see the pinnacle. I'm rushing through here because I'm conscious that we need to finish. But this masonry style here can be found 1,000 years earlier in Tiwanaku in Bolivia. So we know exactly where they got their masonry skills from. We know exactly where they got their ceramic skills, and we know where they got their textiles from. They brought in the skilled labour where it was needed. I'm going backwards now, am I? Their architectural skills, their design skills were very good. And I use this example that's a very, very small set of ruins. If you manage to walk the Inca Trail into Machu Picchu, you might see these ruins. This is Puyapatamaca, and I think this is an interesting style in as much as it's sort of geometric. You can see here the very sharp lines, but what you look at when the front, here it becomes very organic. It actually follows the landscape. And I think this is a prime example of what the Inca saw themselves. They saw themselves as part of a landscape, but they used to show the gods, or show whoever needed to be shown, that they had the ability to change the landscape. They didn't have to if they didn't want to. So what we have here is a landscape that's totally altered, as I said, very sharp, very geometric, and then it starts to conform to the actual topography of the land. But what we're not seeing here is this just piece of that flat rock is known as usnu. It's a sacred area that is natural. It was a focus of attention and a focus for ritual for thousands of years, most likely. And then the Inca came along and built around it. So they used a natural feature, huaca. When the Spanish arrived, they said, "What's that?" And they said, "That's a huaca." And it was generally a pyramid or something like that. What it meant was it's a sacred site. And we see the name huaca everywhere that the Spanish gave it, but it really just means it's a ritual site. So these usnus, or the altar, or huaca, are everywhere throughout the landscape. And then, of course, you get to Machu Picchu, which we all, hold in such high regard, but it's just one of many. we discovered, or Hiram Bingham discovered it in 1911, but when he discovered it, people were living there, so it's a bit of a misnomer, but it's a magic site that lives there. So the point that I want to make here is that the Inca were able to draw together these skills from the deep past that were carried on and through successive generations in various areas throughout the Andes. And I include the Andes running right through the coast because it's a mountainous coastline. And what the Inca were able to do was to draw in the best of all those cultural groups that were around them. They controlled them. But they made them conform to a certain degree. We said, we like your textiles, you come and make us our textiles, but we want you to wear this hat. We want you to use this style in your domestic pottery. So they were making their mark on a cultural group, no matter where they were, that defined them as Inca or Yanacona as the subjects of the Inca, but were working at the behest of that Supper Inca. And through this domestic form, the aesthetic form, and then through ritual. And the ritual was to do with a process called as capacocha, which was human sacrifice that was occurring on the highest points, on the lowest points, so from the coast to the mountain peaks to the islands offshore, linked the entire nation together, the empire together. And that empire was really just defined by the Andes. And so we won't get into the political argument because, the Spanish are given a really bad trot and are blamed for the downfall of the Inca. I would argue that the Inca were doomed, and even if the Spanish didn't arrive, the Inca as a political unit were over. And a new empire, well, not a new empire, several city-states would have taken up, and we would have seen this demise of the Inca Empire if they had not arrived. It was on its knees. But it did connect the entire region, through those number of features and factors that I've mentioned. And that linking was through trade and this road network that went right through the area. But that was not just linking, as I said, through trade. Trade was secondary. It was ritual, and sorry, there's a fly bothering me here. The ritual linkage between the entire nation is what made empire. So I'll just like to leave it there and hopefully give you a good introduction to what you're likely to find if you go to Peru or the Andes in general. Thank you very much. The way they linked is, they connected this area, and what they did was built a massive network of roads. It was very, very similar. And what we find back here, there are garrisons. So these were trade centres, but they would have had priests because they're trying to control religion. They recognised that you might have had your own range of gods, but ours are better, so we will introduce our own gods. So it's certainly it does mirror. But I think I hark back to all the time, humans solve problems the same way, whether they're in Africa or North America or Europe. When we look at designs in textiles, when we look at simple stone tools, quite often you can see that design repeated. And in the past we used to say, oh, that means the Celts were here or someone else was there because of this design. But then when we deconstruct it, we realise that they independently developed bronze, in Europe as well as South America. And the way the Romans worked, I think, just that political model is quite easily replicated, and it worked very, very well. It worked very, very well when you had an individual who could control that, and I think we find that with the Roman Empire too. Gets down to the emperor. And what happened with, if you don't mind me going on for a few minutes, what happened to break it down with the Inca was the Spanish conquest arrived, or the Spanish conquest had impact before they set foot on the continent. And that was in the form of smallpox. So the last true Inca died of smallpox. He heard that his people were dying.
So he raced off to see what the problem was, and there's an actual woodcut of a painting of him with spots all over him dying in Ecuador. And what he didn't do was leave the succession plan. And so he had two sons, one who had legitimacy, meaning he was Cuscanian, he was born in Cusco, and then one who was the half-brothers, and he was born of a princess or royal woman from Ecuador. So he had no legitimate claim to become Sapa Inca, but he was a bit more conniving and cunning and ended up taking it. So you ended up with a civil war. So, the Spanish, Pizarro just sat back and waited for those two to beat themselves to death and then, stepped in. And, similar things happen in other empires. But the reason the Roman Empire, one of the reasons why it collapsed, was it was too big. And it was very, very difficult to control. And that's why the Byzantine continued, because it was manageable, whereas the entire empire wasn't. That's what happened with the Inca too. They had reached their geopolitical limit. And these poor guys, these runners, carrying information backwards and forwards, just couldn't keep it up, and they needed internet. There was a good range of languages, and it's actually I'm not a linguist, but I know there's some good linguistic studies, because Quechua was the language of the Inca, and so they spread Quechua. And if you were going to, not necessarily by force, but if you wanted to trade and be part of the Inca polity, you had to learn Quechua. They didn't force it upon you, but if you didn't learn it, or someone in your community didn't learn it, you couldn't trade. It would have been very, very difficult. So what we can do is we can actually follow, in rural areas where there's been less impact, particularly using ethnographic studies, is like, for example, where Aymara is spoken and Quechua surrounded it. And what we find is that these people never became part of the Inca Empire. So there are, a range of languages there, very, very similar. The Aymara and Quechua is not that similar, but once we move down into the jungles, there's this plethora of languages right throughout the Amazon basin, which is a good indicator that the Inca never had, substantial influence into that region. Probably the Spanish had the same problem. The Spanish came in and took over the Inca very, very easily, because they take away the leader and the general, and then the whole place collapsed. When they got into southern Chile, you were talking about small bands that you take away the leader and they're replaced with another. They were like using guerrilla warfare, and the Spanish had great difficulty with those. If the Inca had adopted similar means, Pizarro would have been run out of town. So, but language you can actually trace through conquest, through language.
And once again, Chris Carter, thank you very much.
Con el Wari del amigo, envuelto en mis recuerdos, soy el valor de mi raza, llevo